Hi, everybody. So I'm Rob Murgis, a professor here at UC Berkeley in the law school, and one of the founders and faculty directors of our Center for Law and Technology, which is the programmatic home of our IP and law and tech curriculum and programming here at Berkeley. I know people have been patching into this from all over, and I want to welcome everybody wherever you are, and appreciate your interest in the topic. Just a couple of words of thanks for the BCLT staff. You just heard from Justin, Richard Fisk, another stalwart in our BCLT support staff. They make this all possible, and I hope you get a lot out of it. My primary job is just welcome you and also get the first panel started. So I just want to say briefly, the conference is an outgrowth from a course that I'm teaching with the moderator of the first panel, and that's Dr. Hao Yuan. She is trained as a physicist at PKU in Beijing, then a PhD in physics from Penn State. But she came to law after that, having done industrial research, scientific research in the university setting. She's a perfect co-teacher for me because we're primarily interested in immediate and pressing problems that AI tools are presenting to the IP world. And we hope to be exploring some of those topics. Our course is called IP and Human Creativity in the AI Age. And we've been exploring in-depth issues like authorship, originality, inventorship, non-obviousness, disclosure, all the things we'll talk about today. So the course has been, I think, an eye-opener for me. And I've had the privilege of teaching with Dr. Hao. And it's my privilege now to turn things over for her so that she can introduce our first panel. So welcome, everybody, and I hope you get a lot out of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Murgis. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, everyone from everywhere. So very glad to moderate this important panel. To me, this panel serves a dual purpose. First is to inform our audience of this amazing technological development in AI-assisted inventing process, which is amazing on its own. And secondly, to lay a foundation, a necessary foundation for our later discussion in law and policy. So we are very privileged to have the two distinguished speakers, two top experts in this field. Dr. Ali Madani is the founder, CEO of Fluent Bio, an AI startup in protein design. Previously, he received his PhD from UC Berkeley and led machine learning research initiatives at Salesforce Research, utilizing deep learning, language modeling, and computer vision. Most notably, Ali was the architect of the ProGen moonshot, which demonstrated the first use of large language models for functional protein design de novo. Our second speaker is Mr. Kevin Chen, who is a managing partner of E14 Fund based in Palo Alto. Previously, he was co-founder CEO of Transist, an incubator and investor in impact-driven tech startups in China and the US. Earlier, Kevin was also the founder CEO of Qifang, China's first online student loan service and the first Chinese company recognized by the World Economic Forum as technology pioneer. Kevin is a member of the Aspen Institute's inaugural China Fellowship Program, a WEF Young Global Leader. He was named one of Fast Company magazine's 100 most creative people in business for 2011, was named 2009 Chinese Business Leader of the Year by Horasis and Bacon McKenzie, and is a Social Innovation Park Fellow. He has an MBA from TRIM, NYU, LSE, HEC Paris, a BA from Yale University, and has also studied social entrepreneurship, global leadership, and other subjects at Harvard. So with that, I'll turn to Ali first. So Ali, you are one of the pioneers that started really to use these LLMs to design protein-based drugs de novo. Could you please briefly introduce your work in that field?
Excellent. Thank you for the invite as well. Really excited to the opportunity to speak and discuss more about this ever-changing landscape and topic. I can give a little bit of a background. So I'm actually not a biologist or chemist by training. I'm a machine learning scientist. I've worked in the canonical domains of computer vision, meaning images, videos, and natural language, meaning English text. Most recently, I was working at Salesforce Research, where really a lot of the pioneering work with respect to controllable text generation was coming out. So think before OpenAI's ChatGPT, GPT-2, 3, 4, those different variants. It was the development of these language models that were trained on these incredibly large corpus databases of structured text from Wikipedia to just scraping all of the internet effectively. And the goal was to be able to generate text after learning with simple, elegant objective functions, be able to learn the underlying grammatical structure and semantics of the English language, and then we can steer this to be able to generate documents and answer questions afterwards. I think personally, I have that moment where, when I was experimenting and playing around with it, specifically from the work that a lot of the tremendous researchers at Salesforce were able to achieve, I had this realization that, okay, this is powerful. And where else can we apply this to, broadly speaking? And what were the recipes for success? And for me in particular, I was very excited about the complexity that proteins specifically have that necessitate the usage of deep learning and can have tremendous impact. And they have this similar kind of ingredients that we've seen in English language, where proteins can be represented as a sequence, similar to words in a sentence. You have amino acids that are strung together to form a sequence and fold into structures and develop or execute exquisite functions. And similarly, the reduction of DNA sequencing costs have enabled us to have a wealth of information-rich databases that we can learn from. And that was the kind of intuition there. Okay, we can do incredible things with respect to controllable text generation, and we see similar recipes for success for protein sequences or biology, broadly speaking. And that was the beginning of training a large language model specific to proteins, and then collaborations that we had with folks in academia, UCSF, with Jamie Fraser's lab, a couple other labs within Stanford and Berkeley, and then also within industry, where we then handed these sequences that were generated from scratch to folks in the field and asked the simple question, like, do they work? Are these generations useful to you? And I think as a cautious optimist, as a researcher, didn't have any expectation that this would translate well from research to the real world impact, but it did. The sequences were working, they were functional, they were solving problems. And that was the genesis of Profluent, to continue to go tackle the most challenging problems that we need AI for, specifically within biology and proteins. So
that is just so exciting. So on that note, like, what is the rough success rate of your turnout? Like how much actually do you trust now the prediction given by your AI when it comes whether it's working or not?
Yeah, I think maybe to lay the groundwork here, I can describe and take a step back in terms of how we as humans and as society have gone about finding solutions to many of the problems that we have in biology. And biology, by the way, is not just human health, right? It's more than just drug discovery. Proteins are involved. They enable us to breathe and see, but they also are involved in our daily products, like detergents that we use to wash our shirts, industrial enzymes as well. It's widespread. How we have gone about protein discovery so far has involved basically either two main workhorses. We look to nature and we copy and paste things from nature, or we will take something from nature, or we will take something from nature, and then almost like a thesaurus, we may just flip small words into synonyms effectively, right? In this very large book or document in essence. So really rudimentary tools, and so insofar as we are limited by what nature has provided us, right? And there's clearly a vast white space that we could explore that goes outside of that. So discovery has been limited in terms of a needle in a haystack search process. And what we've been really excited about specifically is to go beyond discovery and move into design. So be able to actually have input attributes that come to mind, whether protein family, molecular function, and so on, to be able to bottoms up from scratch, generate a novel sequence altogether. Now, to answer your question, like what is the success rate of something of that sort? Traditionally speaking, it would be incredibly difficult, like sub 1% success rates.
Right.
Again, this depends on different protein families, but we're witnessing, at least in our Nature Biotech paper and other internal efforts as well, we're hitting like 50% and above success rates in terms of a given library, given number of sequences that we've designed from scratch. You know, a majority could be functional for given use cases. And then added layer, like you mentioned specifically, is the trust aspect, right? How do we develop confidence intervals and metrics specifically to be able to really reliably select the sequences, because we can generate millions, like orders of magnitude larger sequences than we can actually test in-house or in the real world, meaning in the wet lab. So we have to then take millions upon billions of sequences that are generated and whittle that down to a finite, meaningful number, like in the hundreds or thousands or something of that sort, that we'll actually synthesize and test. And that involves like a lot of metrics that we develop along the way. So yeah.
Yeah, that's just awesome. So, but basically you're saying from one traditional like 1% to higher than 50%, that's a huge success. So followed with, you might have touched upon this, but could you just illustrate a little bit more on the human researcher's role, as well as the AI's role in this inventing cycle?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the way I view it personally is, you know, a lot of these AI techniques are, and the techniques that we develop, large language models for proteins specifically, I view these as translators for us. They enable us to read and write biology. We can't speak in so far as, you know, the language of biology. When we see a series of amino acids, it's not interpretable for us. But we can use machine learning models to provide that interpretation, right? And then steer them to be able to generate and write new biology altogether. So yeah, I think generally speaking, there inevitably is a human involved with respect to the objectives that come to mind. Like what are we tailoring it for? And we're utilizing AI as our tool, as our translator in effect. Now, even within that process currently today, there still is like a human in the loop, right? Guiding the scientific discovery process. I think over time though, we're getting better and better. And you know, I think we've just scratched the surface. There's still lots of work to be done. But I think I'm incredibly excited about the versatility and steerability that we can start baking into these models. Think of it as like knobs that we can have available at our disposal that the operator can choose basically to generate novel sequences. So there's still a lot more to be done, but I think humans are inevitably, you know, are critical and going to be involved in this process.
That's great, Ali. So you used the word steer, you know, that's one of the human beings' primary roles still. So does it, my understanding is that also includes, you know, narrowing the problem space for the AI, right? Like, you know, really you have to define it into an AI problem, like basically prediction problem, right? Can you explain just a little bit on that?
Absolutely, yeah. That's a great question. That's you know, I would say still to be. There are many different directions to take it. I think broadly speaking, one thing that we think very deeply about is what types of context can we involve with respect to the steerability. So context meaning that proteins, for example, don't operate in a vacuum, right? Biology is complex with lots of different types of molecules and modalities that interact, and they're dynamical as well. There's the time element too. So being able to bake in more and more biological contexts in our generation process, right? And the knobs that we have available to us, whether it's structural elements, protein-protein interactions, protein-nucleic acid interactions, and so on and so forth, is of great interest to us. And then I think, you know, a future that what would be really great, where I kind of started out with one of my first papers specifically, is if we can have like a natural language interface to deal with all of this. I think we're still a ways away, to be honest. There are some demonstrations that I've shown and other people in the field have shown, but we're still a ways away there in terms of just having imagine writing a sentence basically of the description of what you would like and it being able to generate and take it from there. But that's something that's, it's fathomable for me, a future that's fathomable, maybe far away. Whereas other things like AGI, right? Just general artificial general intelligence, that's something that's not even fathomable for me as a researcher, but that's my opinion. So.
That's very interesting. You mentioned AGIs, that like how far do you think we're still, away from the so-called autonomous inventing AI, meaning the human beings doesn't really need to do anything significant there?
That's a great question. I think I probably opened up a can of worms there. So I definitely won't profess to know everything here, and would be happy to be proven wrong over time. But I personally I think humans are still going to be involved in these creative discovery, goal-oriented tasks specifically. Like I just don't really see that panning out. But I think we will be pleasantly surprised over time in terms of capabilities that maybe AGI-like, for example, right? Something that would be inspiring to us, inspirational to us over time. But I'm a bit more on the pessimistic side on that, or cautious optimist with respect to that topic. But we can go, that is a large can of worms there to go into. So.
Yeah. Well, I just, from my perspective, it's not only whether, how far, can we, but do we really want that future? But that's a different question. So if I could summarize what you have just said, Ali, which was great, that is human beings and AI, they both play very important roles in this inventing process right now, right? So human beings, they kind of steer the direction of the invention, while within the problem space defined by humans, the AI is very capable compared with conventional tools in generating this novel and sometimes maybe a little surprising result. Has a high accuracy rate. You give higher than 50%. Is that a fair summary of your points?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Like currently today, there's more than enough to be excited about as having AI as a tool, right? Like we don't need to dream so much in terms of how it's going to replace us. Like there's plenty to be done and so much to be excited about as a tool on its own, right? Both plenty to be done to work to build better tools and how to think about how that's going to integrate within our society as a whole, whether in biology or otherwise. That I'm incredibly excited and passionate about. So
yeah, that's amazing. So what is the source of your training data here?
Great question. So there's broadly two main categories. So one being unsupervised data. So think sequence level information that is drawn from the collection of evolutionary sequences that we have from nature, broadly speaking, right? So millions of years of evolution, a rich tapestry, a variety of different protein sequences with evolved functions under different selective pressures that we can learn effectively. When people cite foundational models, right? The term, we can learn a foundation, we can build a foundation of what a functional protein might be, and that sequence to function relationship, broadly speaking. So that's an incredibly large corpus database of sequences that we continue to collect with advances in DNA sequencing, metagenome studies specifically, that is core to what we do. So think of that as like the foundation, the bachelor's degree, so to speak, right? And then on top of that, there are supervised kind of assay labeled samples that now you have a sequence and an associated property, whether a binary value or a scalar value. And then that can also be utilized for the models as well in terms of collapsing the space that you're searching within or steering it for a given property or multiple properties at a time. So I would say those are the two types of data sets specifically.
That is a lot of data, right? And you mentioned you have to train the foundational level as well as maybe the more niche specific. Like, so regarding the data and the computing power, how expensive do you run this? I'm thinking about the entry barrier in a way, that how expensive for.
Yeah, I think price is interesting because things continue to get cheaper and cheaper, but our ambitions continue to grow and grow with respect to number of parameters. For example, size of either model, so model capacity, and also the size of data that you want to ingest as well. So it is quite costly. So I would say, just as a point of reference, like back in, let's say 2019, a 1 billion parameter model costs about $1 million to train for a given, a standard set of tokens that were, whether in NLP or proteins, to a suitable level of convergence. Again, very rough off the cuff kind of estimations here. But then within 2 years, that dropped by an order of magnitude and became 100K for the same model size. But the problem, not the problem, the good thing, or the changing landscape over time is then our emissions grow. Like we've blown past 1 billion parameters. That no longer is considered a large language model. And similarly, we have more and more data that we've curated. So yeah, it is expensive, but it depends on like what your goals.
Sorry. So that includes that includes the computer power as well, right? Because as we know, that's a huge resource of expense for your companies too.
Oh, that's purely just compute cost, only compute cost. So to train, so in 2019, a GPT-1, for example, or control model or a progen model would be on that order of magnitude. But now, easily you'll see models that are trained with an NLP nowadays that are, tens of billions or hundreds of billions of parameters, and those will easily go blow past those numbers in terms of compute expenditures. So over single-digit millions for sure, and beyond that. And that's why you actually see a lot of startups are raising these incredible rounds, and maybe Calvin can speak to this as well in terms of where the venture dollars and venture debt is going to effectively is to spend on compute. And maybe one last point as well is finding the right compute is also a challenge too. There's kind of a scarcity.
Right. So you don't pay that much for data, like, because most of the data in public domain, or do you have any licensed data from somewhere?
Yeah, so there's licensed data that you would pay for. A lot of it is from the public domain, correct, in terms of the first bucket of unsupervised sequence level information. But the data generation on the supervised kind of assay labeled examples, that does cost quite some, there is a financial burden with respect to that. And that's usually variable with respect to the DNA synthesis cost, the number of proteins you want to test. There is a per base pair cost associated with that. And then there's also just the infrastructure build with respect to assay development and so on. So that can get quite costly as you have more and more ambitions there as well in terms of characterization.
Thank you so much, Ali. So I have one last question for you in this run. So how do you protect your proprietary AI technologies?
Yeah, that's a great question, and maybe we can continue going into that as well. Like one of the demonstrations that we've shown is that we think about it in terms of a canvas, right? In terms of functional proteins that are available to us. And there are dots on that canvas with respect to where nature has sampled, what we've observed from nature. But there's so much white space to interpolate between those dots, between those samples, and extrapolate beyond nature as well. So I think, generally speaking, what we've witnessed is that we can now, with machine learning, because we can go beyond discovery and do proper design, we can access greater sequence space and structural space that we've ever even thought of. So that really gets into questions of like, how do we actually protect? Like from a composition of matter perspective, is sequence identity, for example, sufficient anymore? What other types of protections should we develop? So I have more questions than answers for that question, but happy to go more.
We can discuss later, definitely. Thank you so much, Ali. I might come back to you later if we have more time or with the audience question. So let me turn to Kevin. Kevin, so could you please briefly introduce your work at E14? What kind of supports do you provide to these startup companies there?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you again, Hal. Thank you, Rob. And thanks, Ali, for a wonderful table setting there. And congratulations on all the really exciting work you're doing at Profluent. So E14 Fund is a venture capital firm, but we're a very unique kind of VC firm in that we're officially affiliated with MIT. And what that means is the team at E14 have roles within the university and then therefore collaborate really closely with what might be traditionally viewed as projects or companies that are very far upstream from a technology startup. In fact, we spend a lot of our time talking to researchers who maybe have no intention of translation or no intention of commercialization and starting a company. And we feel really ultimately our job, as it were, is to support the overall health of this very broad and vibrant research community at MIT. And then our business model is to invest. And so when it comes to the question of the kinds of support that we do, a lot of times it is these very early conversations with people who may be many years away from starting a company, whether they're on campus or whether they are alumni who've left campus many years ago. And it is that early ideation around, team formation. What are the complementary skills required for that team? It is oftentimes thinking about their invention or their technology and the market readiness of it. And as well, we spend a lot of time talking about their go-to-market strategy. Around MIT, there is a really vast and vibrant community of corporates and other collaborators. And a lot of what we do along that journey is to get that research in front of real-world applications as early and as candidly as possible, such that that researcher and that burgeoning company have the opportunity to really find a real problem to solve, a real meaningful problem to solve.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. So a lot of the companies, they involve these cutting edge technologies, and as you say, they're quite upstream. So how many of you involve generative AI substantially in R&D right now?
Well, yeah. So across the broad community, what I would say, in fairness, is just about every single company that we're interacting with right now is working in that broad field of AI, and a majority in generative AI as well. Our home base at E14 is the MIT Media Lab, and Media Lab, as well as other labs that we collaborate with, such as the Computer Science Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT, CSAIL, have been at the forefront of this field for many years, many decades. Founding faculty at MIT, at Media Lab, for instance, included Marvin Minsky. And so as a fund, through our 10 years of our history, from our prototype into our institutionalization 6 years ago, we've been very, very active in this domain. But I would say certainly since the last 12 or 18 months, we're finding that that broad community of research is, even more enthusiastic about what's happening in generative AI in particular. So I'd say whether it's for a customer-facing application or product, or whether it's a novel approach to their own operations, I would say nearly every single company is using these tools now.
Wow, that's impressive. So I'm also wondering about their business models there. So for those, I mean, for those AI startups that use, I don't know if some of them they transform or the more basic foundational models, or they build on other open source foundational models and fine tune them in the niche. Could you just describe a little bit in that area?
Certainly. We see a lot of diversity across the community. As Ali mentioned, this landscape is very dynamic right now. And while certainly there are a lot of companies that are using APIs, that are working with extant large models, and others that are building off of open source models, we are seeing people build and train their own or tune others as well. So there's a lot of variance. What I would say, though, is we're seeing in particular, a lot of enthusiasm in really thinking about, even with the novelty or even with the kind of Cambrian explosion of the last 18 months, if you intend to build a meaningful company in this space right now, it's not just about that AI invention, which may even be at the core of your company. Many instances, it's everything that you build around it, which is significant. So whether that's a company that's then takes a business model which feels a bit more like traditional enterprise SaaS software, but then is building all of the kind of security and protocols or permissioning that an enterprise customer would expect around any interaction with that AI product, or whether it's the infrastructure itself around the AI to ensure auditability or understandability, and really to be foundational to that kind of trustworthy AI that so many customers and users are coming to expect. We're seeing that business models then tend to end up, in many instances, gravitating towards kind of known quantities. But this is where I think we're excited to see that there may be a lot of new variants and new approaches. So even in that simple example of enterprise SaaS software, where traditionally you might, meter your customer based on the number of seats at your customer, number of people who are using that tool. Well, with an AI product, which by its very nature leverages those humans in the loop and would then have far fewer number of people using that tool for equal or more productivity gain, well, then companies are going to have to reimagine perhaps how they would meter, their business model or their business interactions with customers.
Could you please elaborate on your last point? Like we have fewer people, I find it particularly interesting. Yeah.
Absolutely. So traditional software, a lot of traditional software, like a Salesforce.com, for instance, might say, how many people in my customer are using this piece of software? How many people log in and have their own accounts? Slack is a kind of classic example. And the more departments, the more users, then the more that company pays Slack on a monthly basis. But as we see these new tools augmenting people in ways that would represent either changing work functions for those individual employees, and in many regards, people would expect fewer employees. So, for instance, a tool that's doing augmentation of customer service. So if you have AI that can then make the existing customer service people be either more productive or circumvent an interaction with a human, then it's probably no longer appropriate to charge your customer based on how many people actually touch the software. And you might try and experiment towards value-based pricing or some other metric on which to base your invoicing.
Thank you. That's terrific. So regarding your introduction of a variety of companies, and so really, my understanding is that you start to see a diverse value chain starting to come up in this very early stage of, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It is a particularly exciting time, I would say. Even in this last quarter, the data shows that more capital in early stage venture capital was put into AI than every other technology combined. So it is a field where we're seeing a lot of enthusiasm from a founder and an investor perspective, and we are seeing a lot of different kinds of applications and a lot of different technologies being explored right now.
Yeah, so I think that's definitely great news. But my next question is regarding the entry barriers for these AI companies. I know there might be diverse, depends on what kind of things they're doing. So, but do you feel like do you have some companies that need to train more like a foundational level, and do you feel the entry barrier that it might be higher than
that?
Yeah.
I would say yes and no. I guess for E14 in particular, for our fund and our community of founders, we do have a large cohort which are scientists who have been working in this field for some time. And so whether it's, the founders of Mosaic ML who had published a paper several years ago, which became the basis for that company and then that quick productization and rise of that company, or whether it's a recent investment, a spin out from the Matusik lab at MIT, where work that's using large language models to aid in the design and manufacturing process for companies that manufacture goods. We do see that there are unique teams and unique products that are built on years of research and a depth of technical capabilities that are not readily available at large. And so, we would qualify that as, barriers to entry or an entry barrier to tackle those sorts of problems. Of course, access to training data or access to proprietary relationships that would then, instantiate other product opportunities or, market challenges. Those are other kind of barriers that we're seeing too. But I would say, perhaps not unsurprisingly, or yeah, too many negatives in there. But we do see a lot of companies that are, say, just taking OpenAI APIs and trying to wrap GPT with, some sort of variant in some application in a particular domain. So companies with perhaps a very low barrier or differentiation, and then trying to out execute and operate faster than other companies. I think it was this recent batch of Y Combinator companies where we saw a tremendous amount of companies pivot into these kinds of applications, and we saw, as opposed to those kind of many years of research, PhD and faculty founded companies, we saw a lot of undergraduate kind of fresh MIT grads from computer science majors also starting companies too.
Thank you, Kevin. That was great. So I think time really flies. I could, chat with you guys for hours, but we have to turn to our audience. I see they have many questions. I'm gonna just give me a few seconds. I need to ask them according to the sequence they were made. So I also saw a hand by Miss Brenda Simon, but she seems to be later than these questions. So, so the first question I think is for Ali. So it's from Mr. Jeremy Bond. Can ProGen handle post-translation modifications?
Yeah, so I think there's two answers here. They're implicitly the models, the current public models that we have open source today, they essentially kind of hallucinate the other interacting components and downstream processes for proteins. So for example, we have seen that these transformer models have attention heads that have specialized in learning certain concepts like binding site prediction, post-translational modifications, and so on and so forth. But I think what we're moving more and more toward is explicitly involving the context, the protein-protein interactions, the protein-nucleic acid interactions, the protein ligand and small molecule interactions, and so on and so forth, explicitly in the model. So future models will explicitly handle it. So currently it's implicit.
Thank you, Ali. So the next question is from Mr. Lawrence Hussick, but it's a legal question. So the question is, if an AI system can produce more than 50% hit rate, what does this to patentability, especially under obvious to try analysis? So I take that Ali and Calvin, you guys are not patent law experts on this, right? So actually, we're going to talk about this in details for panel 3, Lawrence. So just hold the thought. But I mean, my 2 cents very briefly here is that would definitely impact on these predictability of this solution, so that it would have a substantial impact. But there are other factors to consider as well. So we'll talk more about that. So directed to now panelists, the now 3 questions from Jeremy. The first is that does AI become an inventor actually, this is a legal question as well. Let me sort it out. Give me a few seconds. Yeah, I'm sorry, but these questions they are legal questions. So I'm going to read them first, but we will keep them to panel 2 and panel 3. So the question is, the first is, does AI become an inventor, which the patent office says it cannot be? How handled? We'll talk about in panel 2. And second, if invention features are put into AI, does that become prior art? And we talk about in panel 3. The third would be once technology entered into AI, kind of third party that files faster steal the invention. Those are great questions. Let me write them down. But here is a question from Professor Chen. So what's the rough estimate about the impact on the cost of drug discovery, which is usually cited as being over $1 billion? I think this would be a great question for our panelists to answer, if we still have some time. Yes.
I'll maybe, Callum, if you want to go first, I can go after.
Sure. I would say at this stage, it's a little premature to have a discrete estimate, although I think there's a lot of excitement on what will be the ultimate financial impact here. I think to Ali's earlier comments, I think we're also seeing where AI has the opportunity not just to greatly narrow a search space and reduce waste in that process, but also to expand search spaces to novel candidates too. So net, it may be a little bit difficult to say at this point what, at least from our perspective at the earliest stages, what that economic impact will be to the overall process. But Ali, I'd love to hear what you think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a really interesting question that I can sidestep it by talking about time, but not finances. I think generally speaking, when one thinks about drug discovery, there's a discovery preclinical phase, and then there's clinical development, and there's commercialization. There's gradations and different ways of defining the drug, discovery pipeline as a whole. I think we definitely are going to see an incredibly accelerated timeline for that discovery preclinical phase, where typically that would be on the order of 5 years, 4 to 6 years, let's say. And I would imagine that would be at least, cut by just so I can actually provide real numbers and real estimates here, but don't hold it against me today. But I think we could cut that down substantially, right? More than half, but less than half of that time in particular, which should have tremendous impact. And then everything that Calvin mentioned as well in terms of expanding that space it's huge, really huge.
What about the time? What about the pre-screening time? That's usually a significant part of the drug.
Exactly. Yeah. So the preclinical phase, I would say, is 4 to 6 years. Let's say like 2 years. Like 2 to 3 years. I would envision something of that sort. So.
Yeah. Although maybe to just add a little bit of additional color, what we find is like that tends to be where there's a tremendous amount of prior investment in the infrastructure for that discovery phase. So the shortening of time probably increases the pipeline of candidates that can go through there. And then a lot of the expense for any individual drug going all the way to market would be in subsequent steps. But the interesting thing is AI also have impact in those subsequent steps as well. So we're seeing some really interesting things happening around, candidate recruitment or candidate selection and workflow management in the clinical phase as well. So while we might highlight that first kind of halving of time in the pre-discovery or discovery stage, we're going to see AI impacts across the whole process.
So every stage of the health
Absolutely.
factor.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. And I think that shows also the diversity of types of AI systems too that will be inserted along the drug discovery process, which is exciting.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Mr. Mark Hubbard from the audience. So it's a good question. It's sort of related to my question about the human being and AI's complementary roles, but more in details. I think this is directed to Ali. Can you describe whether and how a person is involved in generation of the protein sequences using the model, as opposed to training, evaluating, and testing the results?
Great. I think,
yeah,
if I understand this correctly in terms of generation, yeah, so there's going to be like a training, either the foundational model or fine tuning of a model, and then you move into a mode called inference, right? Or you're sampling from a model in particular. So there are many knobs that we have at our disposal with respect to how we sample from a model. So for example, there could be, in the original Progen paper, we have conditioning tags that we provide to the model. There could be specifications with respect to how exactly, like what level of diversity and temperature we apply as well. And then again, like the context we provide aside from just amino acid sequences, can we go beyond that we apply to the model as well. So I think there's many options and knobs that we have at our disposal with respect to how we generate. Yeah, I think after generation, there's selection, which is another big area too. So lots to be done.
That's a great answer to me. So we have one more question from Ms. Brenda Simon. I'd like to hear from both now panelists. Do you believe the net effect of AI on employment opportunities will be positive or negative? It's not a purely technical or investment question, but I'd love to hear what you guys think.
I guess my answer is yes. So I think it will be both positive and negative. I think what we've seen with every technology of sufficiently large impact is there will be disruption and displacement, but there will be lots of opportunity. So we expect this to be transformative in productivity across a lot of fields, and to change the job functions, the job responsibilities for nearly everyone in the economy. And with that much change, there will be new jobs created. There will be new opportunities. But certainly it is predicated on us as a society, as a civilization, to think about, the negative impacts as well. Who's getting left behind, and how do we retrain, refunction, and repurpose, all that productive and creative and otherwise human capital.
Ali?
Yeah. I don't have much more to add from there. I can just speak from on a personal level. I think there's so many, kind of dovetailing off the last point that Calvin made quite eloquently. There's so many applications that we can apply AI to, and we can develop AI specifically. And I think there's a responsibility as an operator, as a implementer, right, a developer of machine learning based techniques to choose wisely, right, inevitably, like what applications we want to apply this to, and whether it's going to be, at the very minimum, not harmful to society, right? So I think that's something that I try to remind myself and others as well on our team and externally as well. So
that is very important. So this is actually a very crucial question in my mind too. So I'm going to just follow up with one question. I know now time is almost up. So Calvin, you see a lot of companies in the E14, and I mean, I agree with you in the long term, this will, provide a lot of beneficial opportunities. But what about the short term? Do you see, like some opportunities for training those sort of like lay people, into this AI, generative AI sectors without too steep a learning curve for them in a short term?
It's a wonderful question. I think one of the things, perhaps one of the most exciting aspects of this wave of technology, though, is how accessible it can truly be. The fact that ChatGPT acquired 100 million users faster than any other product in the history of technology is a testament to just how accessible this technology can truly be. So I would hope that, like if we set our expectations and set our resources appropriately, perhaps, a lot of these displaced people aren't, working at OpenAI. That might not be the appropriate expectation, but these lay people, as you suggest, they're using these tools for new productive and gainful employment.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you so much, Ali and Calvin. It was a terrific discussion. I learned so much from you guys. And for our audience, so if you have more questions from our panelists, please send us an email. We can continue the discussion afterwards, in a more leisurely way. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.